There's a version of empath that most people online never talk about because it doesn't fit the fragile, easily victimized stereotype we've all been fed for years. This version doesn't get destroyed by a narcissist. This version, quietly, systematically, without ever raising their voice, ends up being the one thing a narcissist genuinely cannot survive contact with. Today we're talking about the super empath and the 5 specific things they do that a narcissist has absolutely no defense against. Let's be clear about something before we start, because it matters. Most empaths, in the early stages of dealing with a narcissist, get hurt badly, deeply, sometimes for years. The stereotype of the empath as an easy target isn't wrong. It's just incomplete, because it only describes one stage of a much longer arc. What almost nobody discusses is what happens on the other side of that arc, when an empath survives enough cycles of manipulation to finally understand the mechanics of what's actually happening to them. Because once an empath crosses that threshold, once perception turns into strategy and compassion turns into boundaried compassion, they become something a narcissist has never encountered before and has absolutely no functional response to. Here's the first thing a super empath does, and it's the foundation everything else is built on. They stop trying to be understood and start simply observing. This sounds like a small shift, almost too subtle to matter, but it changes the entire dynamic of the relationship at a structural level. Most people caught in a cycle with a narcissist spend enormous amounts of energy trying to be understood, explaining their feelings more clearly, providing more context, hoping that if they just find the right words, the narcissist will finally see the impact of their behavior and change. This need to be understood is completely natural, and it's also exactly the leverage a narcissist uses to keep someone endlessly engaged, because understanding can always be dangled just out of reach, forever, as long as the other person keeps believing it's coming. A super empath does something different, and it happens quietly, almost invisibly from the outside. They stop needing the narcissist to understand anything at all. Instead, they start watching, genuinely, carefully, almost clinically, the patterns. Not with hatred, not even necessarily with anger anymore. Just with the calm, detached curiosity of someone studying weather patterns rather than trying to reason with the storm. They notice, this is the specific sequence that happens before an argument starts. This is the exact phrase used right before a guilt trip. This is the precise moment their tone shifts from charming to cutting. And once you're observing a pattern instead of pleading with a person, something remarkable happens. You stop being surprised by anything. And a person who is no longer surprised is a person a narcissist can no longer destabilize, because destabilization depends entirely on catching someone off guard. This shift from "please understand me" to "I understand you completely" is, ironically, one of the most devastating things that can happen to a narcissist's control over a relationship, because it flips the entire power dynamic without a single confrontation ever needing to happen. The second thing a super empath does, they become completely unreadable in the exact moments a narcissist expects a reaction. This is worth sitting with, because it's counterintuitive. Most people assume the way to handle provocation is to either respond calmly and rationally or to avoid the confrontation altogether. A super empath does neither. They simply don't perform the expected emotional sequence at all, and this absence, this refusal to supply the predictable reaction, is far more disorienting to a narcissist than any argument could ever be. Remember, a narcissist's entire relational strategy depends on being able to predict and provoke your emotional state. They know which comment makes you defensive. They know which silence makes you anxious. They know exactly how long to withhold affection before you start chasing it. This predictive model is the entire engine of their control. A super empath, having studied the pattern extensively, see point 1, starts deliberately declining to supply the expected reaction. The insult that used to trigger a defensive explanation now gets met with mild, almost amused silence. The guilt trip that used to produce anxious over-apologizing now gets met with a simple, flat acknowledgement and nothing more. The silent treatment that used to produce frantic pursuit now gets met with the super empath simply living their life unaffected, exactly as if nothing unusual is happening. This unreadability isn't coldness, and it isn't suppression. A super empath still feels things fully, often more intensely than most people, because their emotional perception was never actually the problem. What's changed is that they no longer broadcast every internal reaction outward for the narcissist to read and use. They've learned to feel privately and respond deliberately, and that gap between what they feel and what they show is exactly the space a narcissist's predictive model can no longer penetrate. And a narcissist without a working predictive model of you is, functionally, disarmed, even if they don't consciously understand why. The third thing a super empath does, and this one tends to genuinely infuriate a narcissist more than almost anything else, they refuse to compete for the narrative. Narcissists, almost universally, run on narrative control. They need to be the hero, or at minimum, the victim. Never simply one flawed person among several in a shared, complicated situation. When conflict arises, their instinct is immediate and automatic. Control the story, reframe what happened, cast themselves as reasonable and you as unreasonable, regardless of what the facts actually were. Most people, understandably, fight back against this, trying to correct the record, trying to make sure the truth wins, gathering evidence, recruiting witnesses, replaying the actual sequence of events to anyone who will listen. A super empath does something that looks from the outside almost like giving up, but is actually one of the most powerful moves available in this entire dynamic. They let the narcissist have the narrative publicly while quietly keeping their own internal record completely intact. They don't need to win the argument about what happened in front of family, in front of mutual friends, in front of anyone, because they've already done the deeper work of point one, knowing exactly what happened, holding that knowledge with total confidence without requiring anyone else's agreement to validate it. This means a narcissist's favorite weapon, narrative control, reputation management, painting themselves as the reasonable one, simply stops working the way it used to, not because the super empath fought back against it, but because they stopped needing to win a battle that was never actually about truth in the first place. This absence of narrative competition is disorienting for a narcissist in a very specific way, because their entire self-concept depends on the story being contested, on there being a battle to win. When someone simply refuses to fight for the story at all, the narcissist is left holding a narrative nobody's actually resisting. And there's something strangely hollow and unsatisfying about winning an argument no one else is trying to win. It's like pulling as hard as you can on a rope that's no longer attached to anything on the other end. The fourth thing a super empath does, they give warmth selectively, deliberately, and never automatically. This is maybe the most important shift of all, because it's the one that finally breaks the specific mechanism narcissists rely on most heavily, the assumption of unconditional access. In the early stages of any relationship with a narcissist, empaths, by nature deeply generous, deeply forgiving, deeply willing to extend grace, offer warmth constantly, automatically, almost reflexively, regardless of how they were treated the day or hour before. This is exactly what makes empaths such attractive targets in the first place. Their warmth isn't conditional on good treatment, which means a narcissist can behave badly and still receive the exact same level of affection and effort afterward, with no real cost. A super empath restructures this completely. Warmth becomes something earned through actual behavior, in real time, rather than something given automatically because of history, hope, or emotional habit. This doesn't mean becoming cold or punishing. A super empath isn't playing games, isn't withholding affection strategically to manipulate the other person back into compliance. It's simpler and more honest than that. They've just stopped performing warmth they don't actually feel in a given moment. If someone was cruel an hour ago, the super empath doesn't force a smile and act as though nothing happened, the way they might have years earlier out of a need to keep the peace. They simply reflect accurately where things actually stand. This is devastating to a narcissist in a way that's hard to overstate, because narcissists have almost never had to actually earn ongoing warmth from the people close to them. It was always simply available, a background constant they could rely on regardless of their behavior. The moment that constant becomes conditional, a narcissist is confronted, often for the first time in the relationship, with an accurate mirror of how their behavior is actually landing. And because their sense of self depends heavily on being liked, admired, or at minimum engaged with, the sudden absence of automatic warmth often produces exactly the kind of anxious, off-balance behavior we've talked about in other episodes. The sudden charm offensive, the unexpected vulnerability, the increased effort, all of it arriving, ironically, only once the free, unconditional supply finally runs out. The fifth thing a super empath does, and this is the one that ties everything else together into something a narcissist genuinely cannot recover from. They build a life so full and self-sourced that the narcissist becomes irrelevant to it rather than central to it. This is the ultimate destination of everything else we've talked about today, and it's worth understanding why it matters so much more than any single tactic or boundary. Narcissists thrive on being the emotional center of gravity in someone's life, the person whose mood determines everyone else's mood, whose approval feels necessary, whose presence or absence dictates the emotional temperature of an entire household, friend group, or family system. A super empath's final, most complete evolution is the quiet, patient construction of an internal and external life that simply doesn't orbit around that person anymore. Friendships that have nothing to do with them. Interests and goals that were never about proving anything to them. An internal sense of worth that was built, brick by brick, entirely independent of their opinion. Once this life exists, once the super empath's well-being genuinely doesn't hinge on the narcissist's behavior, mood, or approval, something happens that a narcissist has no strategy for at all. They simply stop being able to generate any meaningful reaction, no matter what they try, because there's no longer a centralized emotional dependency to pull on. The old tactics, guilt, charm, rage, the silent treatment, narrative control, all of them were designed to work on a person whose emotional world revolved around the narcissist's approval. Once that's no longer true, every single one of those tactics starts landing on someone who has somewhere else to be, something else to think about, and a life that was never actually waiting for the narcissist's permission to be full. This is, in the truest sense, how a super empath destroys a narcissist. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, not even through leaving dramatically. Through simply becoming a person the narcissist's entire toolkit was never built to handle. Calm, observant, unreadable on command, indifferent to narrative wars, conditional with warmth, and utterly, completely whole without them. And in the next part, I want to walk you through what this actually looks like day to day, the specific internal discipline it takes to sustain all 5 of these simultaneously, especially in relationships you can't simply walk away from, and why, once a narcissist realizes what they're actually dealing with, their behavior often takes one of 2 very different, very predictable turns. Let's talk about what happens once a narcissist actually realizes what they're dealing with, because it almost always goes one of 2 ways, and understanding both in advance will save you from a lot of confusion and self-doubt when it happens. The first path is escalation. This is the more common response, especially early on, because a narcissist's instinct when a familiar tactic stops working is rarely to try something new and healthy. It's to intensify the old tactic, on the assumption that it simply hasn't been applied with enough force yet. If guilt used to work and suddenly doesn't land the way it used to, the narcissist doesn't usually conclude, maybe guilt isn't the right approach anymore. They conclude, I need to guilt them harder. if charm stopped generating the eager, grateful response it used to, they escalate the charm, sometimes into something that looks almost desperate. Grand gestures, sudden vulnerability, promises of change that arrive suspiciously only once the super empath has stopped chasing. This escalation phase is one of the most important moments in the entire dynamic because it's exactly when people are most likely to second-guess themselves. The narcissist, sensing the old supply drying up, will often produce their most convincing performance yet. Genuine seeming tears, an uncharacteristically self-aware apology, a level of attentiveness that feels for a moment like real change finally arriving. And this is precisely the moment a super empath's discipline gets tested most severely, because everything in their nature, the deep compassion, the genuine hope for people to heal, the desire to believe the best about someone they once loved, pulls hard toward giving this one more chance. Here's the internal tool that gets a super empath through this specific moment, and it's simpler than it sounds. They've learned to evaluate change over time, not over performance. A single convincing moment, however emotionally compelling, is data from one data point. Real change shows up as a pattern sustained across weeks and months, especially in moments when no one is watching and there's nothing specific to be gained from performing well. A super empath doesn't reject the possibility of genuine change outright. That would be its own kind of rigidity, but they no longer respond to a single performance as though it were proof. They watch, quietly, patiently, and they let time, rather than emotion, be the actual judge of whether anything has really shifted. Most of the time, within this escalation phase, nothing sustains. The renewed charm fades within weeks, once it becomes clear the old strategies of guilt and pursuit still aren't reopening the tap of unconditional supply. And when the charm fades, the narcissist typically cycles back to whatever tactic came before it. Sometimes anger, sometimes cold withdrawal, sometimes an attempt to recruit others into the narrative, painting the super empath as cold, ungrateful, or cruel for finally protecting their own peace. This entire cycle can repeat several times before it finally exhausts itself, and understanding that this is a cycle rather than a series of unrelated incidents is exactly what allows a super empath to stay grounded through it, rather than getting pulled back in by yet another convincing wave. The second path, less common but worth understanding fully, is genuine reflection. This happens far less often than people hope, and it's important to be honest about that rather than offering false optimism. But it does happen occasionally, particularly with people who have some capacity for insight, even if they've never previously exercised it. In this path, a narcissist, faced repeatedly with someone who no longer supplies automatic reactions, automatic warmth, or automatic engagement, occasionally begins to experience something closer to real discomfort with themselves rather than simply frustration at losing supply. This is rare, and it usually requires the narcissist to have some underlying capacity for self-reflection that simply hadn't been activated yet, because it had never been necessary. The old dynamic never required it. Removing the automatic supply sometimes, in a small percentage of cases, creates just enough friction for actual growth to begin. I want to be very careful here because this second path gets romanticized constantly in a way that causes real harm. The idea that if you just hold your boundaries perfectly, long enough, the narcissist will eventually transform and the relationship will be redeemed. That is not what a super empath's 5 behaviors are designed to produce. They were never a strategy for changing the narcissist. They are a strategy for the super empath's own protection, clarity, and freedom, regardless of which path the narcissist eventually takes. If genuine reflection happens, that's a possible byproduct, not the goal, and definitely never something to wait around hoping for. This distinction matters enormously because it protects a super empath from the single most common trap in this entire dynamic, measuring their own success by whether the narcissist changes. A super empath who has genuinely mastered all 5 of these shifts has already succeeded, completely, the moment their own peace no longer depends on the narcissist's behavior. whether that behavior improves, stays exactly the same, or gets worse. The victory was never about them. It was always about becoming a person whose wholeness doesn't require anyone else's cooperation to exist. Now, I want to talk about the internal discipline required to sustain all five of these simultaneously, especially in situations you can't simply exit: a co-parenting relationship, a family member you'll see at every holiday, a work colleague you can't avoid entirely, because this is where theory meets the much harder reality of daily life. The discipline required isn't really about willpower in the way people usually imagine it: gritting your teeth, forcing calm, suppressing the urge to react. It's closer to a practiced, ongoing relationship with your own nervous system, built through repetition rather than force. Every time you notice yourself starting to explain too much and instead simply stop, that's a rep. Every time the old guilt surfaces and you feel it, name it internally and let it pass without acting on it, that's a rep. Every time you catch yourself about to perform warmth you don't actually feel and instead offer something honest and measured instead, that's a rep. None of these moments feel dramatic in isolation, but collectively, over months, they build something that looks, from the outside, almost supernatural. A person who simply doesn't get pulled off center anymore, no matter what's thrown at them. And here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about this entire process, the thing that ties every part of it together. None of these five behaviors were ever really about the narcissist at all. They were about the super empath finally becoming a fully realized version of themselves. Someone whose compassion has boundaries, whose perception comes with discernment, whose warmth is real precisely because it's no longer automatic, and whose entire sense of worth finally, permanently, lives inside them, rather than in the hands of whoever happens to be standing closest. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it says something about this transformation that's hard to capture directly. Picture a lighthouse standing on a rocky coastline, weathering storm after storm, year after year. Ships used to crash against those rocks constantly before the lighthouse was built, pulled in by currents they couldn't see, deceived by a coastline that looked, from a distance, safer than it actually was. The lighthouse doesn't go out into the water to fight the storms. It doesn't chase the ships that ignore its light and crash anyway. It simply stands, exactly where it's needed, steady, unmoved by the wind trying to knock it down, unmoved by the waves crashing endlessly against its base, night after night, without complaint, without needing the storm to acknowledge its presence at all. And here's the thing about a lighthouse that finally truly stops needing anything from the storm. The storm keeps happening, exactly as violently as it always has. Nothing about the weather changes because the lighthouse became steady. But the ships that used to crash against those rocks, night after night, drawn in by a coastline that promised something it never actually delivered, they start finding the lighthouse's light instead. Not because the lighthouse chased them down to save them, simply because it finally became something worth navigating toward. Steady, visible, unmistakably itself, regardless of what the water below it was doing. That's what a super empath becomes at the end of all five of these shifts. Not someone who defeated the narcissist through some final dramatic confrontation. Someone who simply became so steady, so complete, so utterly unshaken by the storm that used to control them, that the entire dynamic quietly stopped being a war at all. Because you cannot destroy a lighthouse by throwing a storm at it. You can only watch from somewhere far below as it keeps shining exactly the way it always intended to, with or without you ever finding your way toward its light at all.